a term that's at least maybe vaguely familiar to some of our audience, the documentary hypothesis, which has to do with the sources of the Old Testament books. So maybe give us just the introductory sort of sermon here on what is the documentary hypothesis, who started it, when did it come into existence, and what was some of the background around this?
Sure. So, in its most recognizable form, it really begins in the late 1800s with a scholar named Julius Wellhausen. Now, Wellhausen is not the originator of the idea. There are several generations prior to him where people postulated essentially what it's known for: four sources. One, a Yahwistic source, one that would use the name Old King James Version Jehovah. So that's the J of the JEDP theory. Or Yahweh, as we would think about it in the Hebrew. One, Elohim, and so sources that use the generic name God, but not the proper or covenant name Yahweh or Jehovah. And then the priestly source and the Deuteronomic source. And so these ideas had been out there for a while. You could go as far back as Benedict Spinoza to think
Yeah.
about someone who was advocating that Moses was not actually the author of the Pentateuch, but would see it as later, or those kinds of things. And so the source theory comes around, and really what Wellhausen does that popularizes it is he kind of stops messing around and says, look, he heard from another scholar, a guy named Graf. So sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis.
Okay.
What he heard was that the prophets preceded the law. And it's a period of German romanticism in this stretch. So there's a love for things that are oral, not written, a love for things that are poetic and lively and life-giving, not codified, not written. Those are dead and sterile. So you can see why they would think the prophets come first. And what Wellhausen really did was he said, I'm not going to look at the Old Testament. What I'm going to do is take my theory of how the religion of Israel grew from this more lively, oral, short, prophetic through to the codified law, the written, and then I'm going to assign the text based on that. And so he really works from a theory of how the religion of Israel evolved to a theory of how the text came to be. So he's purely saying, I'm going to look at this. And so over time, various kind of features or criteria come to play that they'll use to say where there's a split in the text. But so what they're asserting is A, Moses is not the author of the Pentateuch. B, the Pentateuch was written over vast stretches of time, slowly edited together. And in this earliest form, they would say it really was out of four primary documents. One that was oriented around people who worshiped by this name, Yahweh or Jehovah in the old translation, by those who used generically the term God, by those who were oriented around the priestly law, and then those who were oriented around this stream of Deuteronomy and its sort of retelling of the history of Israel. That's kind of the 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I mean, so we would mid 1800s is when Wellhausen is working. But as you said, there's already a lot of speculation in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading one of the history of philosophy books about Spinoza, kind of almost as being maybe the first, one of the earlier figures, Enlightenment figures, to kind of sort of raise the question of Mosaic authorship. And some people might even see him as sort of the father of modern biblical criticism, I guess. But then there's this sort of, German idealism, romanticism, sort of philosophy that is in the air at the time a lot of these guys are working. And you said they're sort of developing a theory of how these ancient cultures must have been, that maybe is influencing. So then creates a model, and then there's sort of like, how can we apply the model to the text? So you feel there's a sense there of the theory sort of overwhelming the data, the actual data.
Yeah, I think so. So to
in
be
front of
fair to them, I
yeah.
think what they would assert, and what many would today that still hold to this, is it's what we call a heuristic. It may not get us
Tool.
to the right answer, but it's a helpful way of thinking,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So if we're looking at it from this perspective, it's a helpful way. So they would then see that it explains features that they do see in the text. So they would look at things like, well, why are different names for God used?
Yeah.
There
Okay.
must be an explanation for that. Why are some stories told more than once, or why are stories told repetitively? Maybe that means that there was more than one version running around. They're going to look at things, places where they have a sense that there's a contradiction. So maybe these are from two different sources that were wedded together. Things like that, that they would say are literary evidences of these things. Changes in style, literary style, say within the Pentateuch, that they would assert that makes it look like it's not written by a single author because it doesn't all sound and read the same.
Right.
So
Right.
they
Right.
are looking at literary evidences, but then their means of saying, what do I do with these things I have questions about? Well, here's a theory that they say is helpful. So I'll just plug all that data into this theory, and then here's where it goes. And
Yeah.
so they do start with a theory, but they are working with real
Which
pieces of
that's
evidence.
yeah. I mean, and that is the burden of, well, not just every scholar, but of every man, to have to work with some kind of mental model, theory, and then look at the data and see what explains best the data in front of us. So yeah, we don't want to. I don't want to. We don't want to ascribe any malintention. Actually, I was reading in just recently in a book by Peter Berger, the sociologist of religion, where he just mentions Wellhausen, um, on one or two pages about Wellhausen, and he kind of talks about how this was a real struggle for Wellhausen. Like, we shouldn't, probably don't want to, you know, um, like, interpret these guys as just like malevolent actors or something, that apparently for Wellhausen, as he had the model and he's applying it because he probably thinks this is the best of sort of like analytical tools of the day, and he's in the culture of his time as well, and that's going to influence his own thinking. But that this actually was a struggle for him, and he considered retiring from his professorship of Old Testament and so on and so forth. So that
Yeah,
as he
many
was
of
just,
them stepped out of the pastorate
yeah,
as they
yeah,
moved
yeah,
because they felt like they couldn't teach anymore. And some of
right,
the
right,
earlier ones actually lost their professorates because they were so far outside the mainstream at that point.
yeah,
And now it becomes mainstream down the road. But many of them really wrestled with this at a personal level because it has implications for how they understand the scriptures and what they
yeah,
think about
yeah,
God. And so it was oftentimes, I mean, this is, I think even Spinoza is there. He's wrestling with what it means to be Jewish, and what the sort of the faith is and how I should understand truth. So these are oftentimes deeply personal kinds of things that come in. And so while I would kind of vigorously disagree with them on how they read the text, I think
yeah,
many of them were going through some fairly personal kinds of angst over
yeah.
what to do with all of this.